Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this sixth in our series of higher education dialogues being put on by the British Council. My name is Kevin Van Quarter. I'm a higher education advisor based at the British Council in the UK, and I will be moderating the session this afternoon. We've got an hour and we have four fantastic speakers who are lined up to give you their views on the topic. Just to start off by explaining that this session will be recorded, so you're aware of that. And if you've missed previous sessions, you can actually find them on YouTube, and you'll see a link coming up in the chat during the course of the session. I think just a little bit of background, this series of dialogues was formed in response to some of the common challenges facing universities in our region of what we call wider Europe, which is basically a much larger Europe than just the European Union. And we have an audience, a global audience for this event, and I think about 300 people have registered, so we have a very large audience who are really keen to debate this topic. So the session today will include some insight from the panel members, and each of our panel members is going to give you a 5 to 6 minute introduction to the topic and give you their views, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. The topic session today is how can universities engage with and motivate students online? We all know that more and more universities around the world are having to move their teaching online, and we really don't know in many countries when students may go back to campus. So how can we effectively engage and interact with these students is a big challenge. This is the challenge which our four speakers are going to address today. How can we continue to motivate and inspire these students? So I think there's a range of different perspectives here. I'd like to introduce our panel now. We have four distinguished speakers who are going to speak to us this afternoon. We have Dr. Liz Marr, who's Pro-Vice Chancellor for Students at the Open University in the UK. The Open University is the UK's largest online deliverer on open and distance learning. We have David White, who is Head of Digital Learning at the University of the Arts London. We have Dr. Jan Bamford, who is Head of Student Experience and Academic Outcomes at London Metropolitan University. And we have Sena Katal, who's a Research Assistant and member of the Student Committee at the Turkish Higher Education Quality Council. And we're going to start with Sena. Just before I ask Sena for you to give your presentation, I just wanted to say that there is a poll which has come in the meeting chat. So you can, if you have a quick look there, you'll see we're just asking you a question about your background, where you come from, so we can get a sense of the types of individuals who have joined the meeting. And there'll be a couple more questions put into the meeting chat later on as we go through the session. And please also do put in your comments there and questions. Again, so towards the end of the session, we will be trying to moderate some of those questions and putting some of those questions to the panel as part of the debate. So because we're relatively limited for time, I think I'll hand over now to Sena to give her perspective on this topic. Sena, please.
Okay. Is it okay?
Please go ahead, yes.
Okay, hello everyone. Firstly, I want to say that I feel pleased to participate in this kind of activity, so thank you to British Council. And before the other panelists, I will handle the subject from a student perspective, because this is a different experience compared with academic stuff. And everybody knows that the coronavirus process that is creating change in every part of society, and everything has stopped. This global spread is already having a massive impact on universities and students, undoubtedly. The classes were suspended on March 16 in Turkey, and a total of 7.9 million students studying in 208 universities in Turkey, and they are having their education disrupted by the spread of coronavirus, and suddenly they transfer to distance education. I think that this process can be called a kind of emergency remote teaching, because the learning experience of students who had their education changed from on-ground to online delivery. Students' adaptability and motivation is the most important issues in this new system, because all of a sudden they get into a new learning environment. This environment brings about some concerns for students. Competencies, rate of technology literacy, technological infrastructure, and accessibility have an important role in the continuity of teaching and learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, a current survey that is applied by the Student Commission of Turkish Higher Education Quality Council showed that prevalence factors that affects the students' learning motivation during the pandemic. As you see, with the big differences, students think that teaching and learning processes like course load, lack of organized structure of the lesson, and also the accessibility to the internet seen as a big problem. I think that the main requirement for a qualified distance education process is the availability of eligible technological infrastructure and accessibility means in both the institutions and students, because each student doesn't have the same opportunities. So in distance education, which makes the use of the internet compulsory, all conditions must be equal for students. Otherwise, teaching and learning period cannot be effective and useful. In addition, such deficiencies bring about some problems in competency issues. I think that students who are educated with this challenge we will feel the inadequate of 21st century competence qualities during their working life. And on the other hand, of course, everything is not going bad, but I must say that as a master's student, the new condition in education, it can be accepted as an ideal environment for the master's students. It can be made an opportunity to evaluate the time we spend in daily life by reading and researching more. And also, on the other hand, as a Higher Education Quality Council Student Commission, in this term we closely followed the webinars and studies of the students' commissions of many countries and also works of quality council in the pandemic period for a while. Then these research motivated us and we decided to organize a webinar series in order to both inform the students and increase their motivation. And each week in these webinars, we are trying to explain the problems faced by students during the online education. We are taking their opinions and creating an active process altogether. On the other hand, we started to organizing various surveys for students to increase contributing and to learn their demands as a stockholder of this process. Then we analyze their concerns and motivation methods to organize new activities and to increase their motivation. In addition, we try to develop and align our communication network with students via social media. I think that these kind of activities contribute to make this process easier. And from a student perspective, the current situation like that in Turkey, but I just want to add something. The end of my presentation, I would like to ask some questions to panelists that I'm particularly curious about. Okay, and first one is related with the practice-based courses, especially I wonder it as an architecture student. As you know, some practice-based courses have to need a space that provides learning by doing. But I think that the meaning of space started to change in education environment and it affects the student skills and reproductivity process. And what kind of methods can be applied in the distance education process in order to prevent the lack of experience and skills of students in practice-based departments? And the second question is, As you know, one of the most important issues of distance education is the organization of content and efficiency of courses. Students lose concentration and interest due to the content and long hours of online courses. How do you increase student motivation in this regard? And the last and third one is in the assessment process of distance education. It is much more challenging to monitor the student due to the physical distance. How do you measure student success through assessment and evaluation remotely? These are the questions that I'm interested and curious about in this process. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Kevin. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, apologies. Basic mistake there, apologies. Thank you very much for that. That was fantastic. We have there, so you've posed a series of questions to kind of frame the contribution of the next three speakers. So it'd be great if the next speakers, Liz, if you could just have a think about those questions when you give your presentation. So I'll hand over, I think, now directly to Liz, Dr. Liz Marr from the Open University for your thoughts on this topic. Thanks, Liz.
Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you, Senna, for setting us up so nicely with those very critical questions around the digital or online learning experience. As Kevin said, I'm Pro-Vice Chancellor for Students at the Open University in the UK. And for those of you who don't know us, we are the largest university in the UK. We have 170,000 students. Apart from a few postgrad research students, all our students study at a distance, either through an entirely online experience or a blended experience with some face-to-face and some online tutorials. Most of our students are part-time. Some of them are studying full-time, but only a very small number, and maybe not for their whole qualification. We have around 20,000 students who have some kind of disability. So there's a huge number of students with special educational needs. The majority of our students are in work, so they're fitting their study around the work and their workplace, their work responsibilities. And around 5% of them are carers, so they have caring responsibility for another adult or an elder relation. And the average age of our students is about 27, and that has been coming down gradually. And very, very many of our students have no prior qualifications, so they don't need an entry requirement to get into the university. We try to scaffold the support for them as they come through the study journey. If you want to have a look at some of our materials, if you have a look at OpenLearn, I'll put a link for that in the chat in a little while. OpenLearn has some free samples of Open University materials that anybody can access and use, so you can see the kinds of things that we deliver. This session is very dear to my heart because it's about engagement and about motivation. And I think, personally, I believe that engagement is the key to success for students, particularly if they're studying at a distance and particularly if they're studying in an online environment. Because studying in that way needs you to be self-motivated, it needs you to be organised, it needs you to be able to prioritise. And I believe that Open University students are very kind of resilient and very good at multitasking because they have to be. They have to manage with what life throws at them. But they've always studied at a distance, either supported by television broadcast programmes or online materials. And so we've never had to substitute, if you like, the face-to-face experience for an online one because we've never had a face-to-face experience with our students. And one of the things that I think concerns me around what's happening at the moment is that people are sometimes tempted to say, yes, we'll move straight online without thinking about the pedagogy that's associated with that how you can how you need to develop your online learning materials so that they are engaging and motivating. And I think some of the questions that Senna raises here are very important. I mean, one of the questions she raised was around how you get practice-based activity when you're studying at a distance. We have developed virtual science labs. We have a virtual microscope, so we can allow students to engage in practice-based activity during their studies using those technologies. But I think there is this temptation to recreate the face-to-face in the digital environment can provide perhaps an experience which isn't as good as it might be. And so I would strongly argue for, as Senna hinted at there, some kind of quality assurance mechanisms that can be used and applied to online digital delivery to ensure that people are getting a really rich learning experience. So I think there are three ways in which we manage student engagement at the Open University. We do it through our learning materials. So our learning materials are designed for people working at a distance. They have the kind of test checks embedded in them. The assessment is very much part of the learning experience, and we have very detailed feedback, or feed forward as we call it, to students so that they can learn from their continuous assessment as they go through the modules. Academic support is really important for engagement. Our students are all allocated to a tutor for each of the module they study, and the tutor will keep in contact with them via telephone, via email, via messaging, whatever is the preferred route for the student, and they will meet their tutors either at face-to-face tutorials in some instances. Obviously that's not possible at the moment, but we also have online tutorials using Adobe Connect, and so all our students are still able to attend their tutorial sessions. We also provide very strong and extensive information, advice and guidance to students, and again that's delivered through email, through telephone contact, through web chat, those kinds of activities. We use forums, so students can engage with each other and with academic colleagues on those forums, either in relation to their module or to their qualification. And students, very many of our students will set up their own support networks, setting up their own Facebook groups or their own WhatsApp groups, for example. We have, during the pandemic so far, we've had quite a number of our academic colleagues setting up virtual coffee mornings or quiz evenings to bring the student community together, and so that they're not feeling so isolated. But engagement for me is not just about keeping involved in your study. It's also about being engaged in that academic community and feeling as if you are still part of an academic community, which of course for students who are just starting university now or planning to in the next few months are going to find it difficult to experience because of the restrictions that are likely to be in place. So how do you create that engagement, that listening to the student voice when you're at a distance from the students? We have a students association, which is very similar to the Union of Students Union, which most universities have. And we work very closely with that association to make sure that the student voice is embedded and incorporated in everything we do. So we have a lot of committees that students are members of. We have in the meetings either through Skype or through Teams so that students can engage with us, and they can feed in their concerns, their issues, the things that they're interested in through those mechanisms. But I think there's one innovation that I just want to talk about, which for me I'm very proud of, and it's something called Student Hub Live, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in a moment when I finish speaking, because you can have a look at that and see how you might be able to adapt something similar for your own institution. So Student Hub Live, and I believe Chaos Films may be in the audience today, so shout out to them. They're very instrumental in producing Student Hub Live. It's a webcast series of events for students, which includes interaction via social media. So it's effectively like watching all your academic colleagues on telly, and students can watch that. They can ask questions directly of staff. We began it as a kind of virtual freshers fair, and it's expanded since then to become very event-led, and we now have extracurricular Adobe Connect sessions on boot camps, on study skills, that kind of thing, so that students can really feel that they are part of a community. And we've had some fantastic feedback from students about how that has made a difference for them, particularly when they already live in remote areas. So we've expanded that work out, and we're it's really one of the most enjoyable things that I've been involved with, and it's possibly means that we're the only university in the country where, in the world possibly, where students can directly question the Vice Chancellor or the Rector of the university on their very first day as a student. So I'm particularly proud of that. I'm going to stop there and leave that for now, but I'm sure I can come back and answer any questions later on. Thank you, Kevin. You're on mute, Kevin.
Okay, there we go. Thanks very much, Liz. We've already got a lot of questions coming in. What I think we'll do is we'll save those until we've heard from our other two speakers, and then we'll come back to you with some of the questions that are coming in on the chat, and we'll manage that. Just before we move on to David White, Summer, I think you've got a graph to show us, which is the results of the poll we put on, just to see the participants on the call, so we can get a sense, everyone can get a sense of where people are coming from. So we've got the majority are academic and management staff. That's very helpful. Thank you. See if I can see. Yeah, thanks so much, Summer. That's useful. I'll be asking another question for everyone to give their view on what they think of the student engagement with, between face-to-face and online after we've heard from our four speakers. So let's move on to David White, who's Head of Digital Learning at the University of Arts London. So David, and if you can address the question of practical students who are studying practical subjects.
Yeah,
I think.
Sure.
Thank you.
So, hi, yeah, I'm Head of Digital Learning. University Arts London, for those who don't know, is actually the largest creative arts focused higher education institution in Europe and possibly beyond. We're not sure. And so obviously moving online was a really big move for us, because the creative arts and design have a kind of tradition of studio-based work, materiality, embodiment, some of the things that was mentioned earlier by Senna, actually. And so that was kind of a very abrupt and radical shift for us. But I think it's important to acknowledge that there's a difference between what we've had to do really rapidly because of the crisis and what the pros and cons of online learning are. Sometimes they get mixed up. So one of the questions, or some of the questions that have been coming up or being discussed, is around the idea of student engagement. How do we know students are engaged? How can we create an engaging environment online? And that's always been, there's something very interesting going on for me because of this very quick shift in context to online. We've suddenly started asking a lot of questions that we ask less often when we're doing face-to-face learning, like how do we know whether our students are engaged or not? Because the answer is, well, we don't really, or there are certain points where we can check. So feedback points, or as Liz was saying, feed forward points. And in some senses, that most of higher education is framed around assessment, and assessment is the point where you find out whether your students are engaged or not. But maybe it's too late by then. But I always think it's worth remembering that assessment exists in the system and can be really useful if it's handled properly in terms of making sure that what we're providing is engaging. So I think it's really hard to know whether students are engaged. What we did immediately, as soon as the crisis started, as soon as the UK went into lockdown, is we gave very particular advice around the balance between what we called content and contact, and that it was important to have a balance between those two things. I think one of the things that we've seen is that teaching staff are really keen. You know, whenever you do something new quickly, you tend to mirror the practice that you did before. That's understandable. And certainly in the UK, we're focused around this idea of contact hours. And contact hours is one of the ways that we kind of quantify what we're providing for students. Now, the problem with that is that as soon as we went online, there's always a temptation to say, well, what's the closest online equivalent to the way we were teaching face-to-face? And to do that. And that would lead to, or there's the danger that that leads to very, very long online synchronous sessions. And I think what we're all experiencing, and this is well known, been known for a while, is that you know, online synchronous sessions somehow more intense and more tiring than being face-to-face. And so if you used to have a face-to-face teaching session for 2 or 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, then suddenly moving that as a sort of online synchronous session for 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon actually creates quite an unsustainable, quite a difficult environment. And I just thinking about this morning, I was thinking of this kind of pedagogy as the attention attrition. You know, who can survive in terms of concentration, which is not a great way of going about it. So one of the things that we've been trying to promote is this idea of transposing your teaching practice online rather than just mirroring practice online, and finding different modes and different ways of engaging students. And these modes of engagements, a lot of which are asynchronous, Liz was talking about quite a few of these different modes, because obviously the Open University are very experienced with this. We know what works. You know, people who do fully online distance learning have known this for 20 years, but it takes a while to shift. It's also difficult as well in terms of, a little bit like I was mentioning, the difference between the crisis and online teaching. There's a really interesting challenge here, which is to do with the perceptions of students, in the sense of, completely understandably, but in the sense of what do students perceive doing university to be, if you like. And if you've signed up to a face-to-face institution and then a lot of it shifts online, then even if that online teaching and learning is quite effective, and we see lots of positive stories, we see attendance is up, we see actually the different modes of engagement, the different affordances of online actually really help certain students, especially quite often students who perhaps don't have English as a first language, or who might find discussion in a face-to-face environment creates a lot of anxiety. Perhaps it's a less anxious thing to do online. Even with all of that, there's always the danger that students don't recognize online as an authentic part of what education is, just because of the way that it's been framed, or because of cultural expectations. So I think one of the questions that was framing this whole session was about how we motivate future generations. And for me, I think it's really important that we find ways of kind of reimagining or reframing higher education, so that there's an understanding of what the value of online is, and that online is can be extremely effective and authentic, especially if you're a predominantly face-to-face institution. It really struck me that Senna's pie chart said that 43% of the concern was around learning process, and that's the same as face-to-face. Okay, so I think actually a lot of what's happening at the moment is we're scrutinizing things that have always been there, but this sudden shift has brought more scrutiny on actually how we teach, on what we're trying to achieve, on how we engage students. And it just so happens that a lot of that discussion is taking place relative to the online, because that's where we are. But actually, in essence, a lot of those conversations are just about higher education, you know, in principle, if you like. So I think that's worth noting as well. In terms of practice-based, I'll just come back to that. We've had some successes because we do run some blended and online distance courses in really sort of intense creative areas. We've got short courses in fine art. We've got fully online distance course in documentary photography and journalism. We ran some, a member of staff, Lewis Bush, ran some great sessions on how to do demos of live, creative physical processes from the comfort of your own home, and that's perfectly possible. There are a lot of creative practices that don't require specialist workshop facilities necessarily, and it is possible to do them online. The other thing that we've done as well, which is to remind people in some ways that we don't entirely just mark the object that's created in creative practices. We actually mark the way that students can talk about and reflect on the narrative, the journey that brought them to that point. So one of our assessment criteria is realization, and what we've done is adjusted some of our assessments so there's a slightly less emphasis on realization and more emphasis on things like process and communication. So you can actually, even in the creative arts and design, there's an awful lot of really effective pedagogy that isn't necessarily about that final object. So yes, where you need to use really specialist equipment that is only available on campus, we've had to move that to, further into the future in the courses where we can. But there's an awful lot that we can do online. I think the one thing that is really difficult to do online is what I'd call ambient presence. So I was talking about contact hours. I think it's actually more useful to talk about the idea of presence. So I think what we all need right now is to have that sense of presence with each other. And for students, I think they want to feel that they're present with teaching staff. They want to feel that they're present with each other. And there are lots of different ways you can do that online that might be formal or informal. But I think pedagogically, that's a really useful way of describing the overall aim. How can we maximize presence under any circumstances? I mean, whether we're fully online or whether we're face-to-face and online. But the one thing that I think that's difficult to recreate online is ambient presence. So, for example, the reason that we might go to a library to study, even though we could do it at home, is because we like to feel that people are around us and doing similar things. I think a lot of our students spend quite a lot of time on campus. Sometimes they go to campus because they want to collaborate with each other. Sometimes they've got lectures, workshops, but often they just want to be working in an environment where there are other people around them and they have this ambient kind of human presence. And that's something that's really difficult to recreate online. And I think all of us kind of feeling that we're missing that somewhere in there. I think you can create communal moments. I think you can create collaborative moments. As I say, there's a lot of creative practice that you can carry on doing online. But when I gave it some thought, I think it's that idea of ambient presence that is, I don't know exactly what that would look like. In certain gaming environments, it's something I wrote about years ago. You get that because the general text chat is ticking up. So it's quite nice if you're in an online lecture and you can see the text chat moving, even if you're not reading it, because you get a sense that other people are there. So I think that's a real challenge for us online, is what can we do within teaching, if we're in research seminars, whatever it might be, to sort of maximize that feeling that we're in a space with other people, that we are co-present, even when those other people aren't talking. That's what you don't get for free online, and that's what you get for free when you're embodied in a room together. So yeah, just to finish up, in terms of looking to the future, I'm really interested in ways of sort of reshaping the language around higher education, so that we don't end up with this divergence between face-to-face and online. It's another reason why I like the term presence, because presence makes sense in face-to-face environments and online. So that in the future, as we inevitably end up doing more stuff online, which I think we will around higher education, certainly not to this extent, but we'll end up doing more, that students recognize that as a valid part of their education, rather than something you're doing because you can't get in a building or because there's not enough room in the building. So that's the question I'm asking myself, and I think a lot of it's got to do with shifting the culture. I don't think it's as much to do with what's effective as we might imagine. I think it's to do with our own sort of expectations in our kind of cultural sense of what university is and isn't. We have to broaden what we think university is from a sort of cultural perspective. I'll stop there.
Thanks, David. There's some really interesting thoughts there, and I think the idea of the sort of presence is really interesting, and how we might engage better on that area. I was just going to, before I ask our final speaker to give her presentation, I just wanted to, we've been trying out this kind of idea of a snap poll, so I'm going to ask someone to put in the chat a quick question to you all, just have a quick think about, a very simple one, and the question is really to ask you all whether you think student engagement is online is better, worse, or the same than face-to-face. It's just so we get a sense of how people are thinking at this stage, and then we might come back to that at the end. So that will come up in the chat in the next minute or so. So our final speaker, I'd like to hand over now to talk to Jan Bamford, who's Head of Student Experience and Academic Outcomes at London Metropolitan University. So Jan, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. Thank you to the British Council for having me on the panel today. This subject is something close to my heart, and as you might appreciate, given the job that I do, the move to online has involved a significant amount of work. Unlike the Open University, we're a face-to-face institution, so the past few weeks we have encountered a significant shift. And I think I'm probably going to, it's probably appropriate that I follow David, actually, because I'm going to echo some of what he's saying there, because I think this may now constitute a shift for higher education in pedagogy terms. So my research interest is in culturally diverse classrooms and the student experience of culturally diverse classrooms. And my institution, London Metropolitan University, is an urban institution, and so we have a lot of commuter students, probably quite similar profiles to the Open University students, in that, as far as the UK government is concerned, 97% of our students have some sort of recognised disadvantage. They either come from the lower socio-economic groupings, at least 60% of them, and 69% of them come from how the UK government defines ethnic minority backgrounds. And they maybe have more than one disadvantage. So going to university, they may be a first generation attender, for example. They have families, they have caring responsibilities, etc. So quite similar to the OU. And I think that often they live at home, so they're commuting, they're working, they can't afford university, and this online situation is obviously generally speaking, I think I could say that they've been quite understanding, because the university is engaged very actively in the shift to online or remote delivery. So there's two parts to it, as David acknowledged. There's the sort of emergency measures that we've had to put in place, and then there's looking forward and what actually we're going to do for the future. And like many institutions, we haven't finally decided what form next year is going to take. But I think there will inevitably be, at least in the second semester, some sort of physical element. It will obviously also then depend on the government advice and what's required in terms of social distancing. So I don't see that we're now going to become an online institution. I think the Open University has the corner on the market with that, and we now need to think about adaptation. And I think I'm going to say that this new environment we find ourselves in is actually an opportunity. So that's where I sort of agree with David. I think that there's an opportunity to reframe the way in which we do higher education, and to perhaps change our idea of a university. Ron Barnett often talks about what is a university, and I think we need to think in those terms. And what I see is the possibility of a shift, that in fact an emergency measure is going to broaden our pedagogic aspirations, and that what was previously perhaps the specialism of a few, so the flipped classroom where the majority of work reading is done outside the classroom and the classroom activity is what helps students to get a deeper awareness of the subject and learning, may become the new norm. That in actual fact our pedagogy is going to be much more active and interactive and engaging, and there is potential for the experiential dynamic to be enhanced. And some of the work that I've done in terms of looking at culturally diverse classrooms focuses on the need to encourage motivation through the development of a sense of belonging for students. There's a lot of discussion of what this actually means and how universities are working through this and how you do this in this new environment. Because I can see that certainly the autumn is going to present challenges for new students coming into university and for transitioning into university. So going back to what I was saying there, therefore, universities, I think, and I have quite strong views on this, rely on majoritively didactic methods. So the teacher stands at the front of the classroom and the students listen, and we need to change that. We need to shift that. We can learn a lot from the Open University. Unfortunately, we've rushed into it, so we haven't had the chance to learn in more depth. But I think, I mean, somebody's mentioned, I think Senna mentioned in her questions, how do you increase student motivation? And this issue of motivation and people just sitting at home and not actually finding the time to go online is a huge one. And how do we engage the students? And obviously the OU has been doing it for quite a long time. So I think there is a model there. For our students, interestingly, the last few weeks have seen, in some senses, more engagement from some students, simply because their lives mean that they affect their ability to come to university, even though it's a tube ride away. They've got caring responsibilities. They've got to take the children to school, so they can't go to a 9 o'clock lecture, or they've got to work, and actually they can go online. So I think we're going to have to look at a future of much more blended offering, even if the first semester is online in totality. I'm not sure, but certainly a blended future is something that I think is now no longer a just given an acknowledgement by higher education specialists, but actually a reality. And I think once we've made that shift, it's going to be for the benefit of all. And I think also, I mean, Senna's question, you touch on how can we assess and evaluate the contributions of students? Well, there's two things here, I think, that from what I've seen are going on. And probably Liz knows this only too well, is that in terms of engaging students, small bite-sized chunks are much more effective than a long lecture. You can't do it. It's far too exhausting. Even if it's asynchronous, it's exhausting to watch something online. So you have to do small bite-sized chunks combined with interactive activities. What our students are feeding back to us is that they want interaction with the lecturers in a synchronous way online. So the university has to try and support that and support the change to the delivery methods that lecturers have to make, and which is resulted in a huge learning curve. I'm not going to say it's all roses in the garden, because of course it has meant that there's been a huge learning curve for many colleagues. It's been a learning curve for me. I've had to use all different kinds of software, for example, but it is possible that that online engagement is actually quite a productive form of learning, but it does require the student to have some discipline and motivation themselves. And other students have the students' feedback is that they need to form groups with each other, like WhatsApp groups, so that they can generate that motivation. They can motivate each other. That's another thing, I think. And this idea that working with the group, so collaborative, and it comes back to possibly some of the key principles for an online engagement framework, that there are sort of 3 essential elements to engagement, which is cognitive, which is the delivery of the subject, collaborative, which is enormously useful. Students need to meet and talk, even if it's just online. And then that emotional, and this is what really concerns me, is how we build communities online. And I do see going forward, there is a challenge around this. I think you were talking about the building of the community and how we do this, and the need for academic support in huge amounts, actually, for students. So we have a system of academic mentoring, and those people have been finding that the increase in the workload enormous. So I think that's one of the things that universities need to do, but also that you need to facilitate small group teaching. That maybe more than 15 is too much for an online space. So this idea that you can deliver an online lecture it's not feasible. So it's rethinking the timetable too. I think looking at the time, I probably should stop. Kevin's been very polite enough. So I'll wrap up by saying, yes, we know, I mean, tech poverty is one of the challenges that we have. We've got students trying to do their courseworks on their phones and things like this, and the university's loaned laptops, quite a number of laptops out to students. So going forward, these are all things that we need to be aware of in an online environment. But overall, I think there is potential not just to rely on traditional assessments, but to focus on more innovative assessment that actually really assess learning outcomes and rethink the way in which we do things, build in, feed forward in a much more constructive way than what we have done in the past. So I'm going to say that long term, I see it's an opportunity. I see it's for the benefit of higher education and for the survival of universities in the future. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jan. That's fantastic. And quite a lot of questions have come in around motivation, and you've actually answered a few of those as you were speaking. So that's fantastic. Thank you. I just, Summer, could you show the results of that second poll? I think it's interesting for us just to see a snapshot of what people think around the difference between engagement online, face-to-face and online. We've got 3 people think that engagement is better. And most people think engagement online is worse. So that's an interesting snapshot. I've got the right way around, haven't I, Summer? It's not the other way around, is it? Tell me if I got it the wrong way around. Okay, so we've got several questions here around motivation, and I wonder if maybe Liz, David, you wanted to comment, and Senna, because I think Jan, you've sort of covered these actually in your presentation. But questions have come in around what happens if you've got students who aren't motivated? How do you engage them? Often students, it's a question here, I'm sorry, I don't know who sent the questions in, but one that says students are often shy in sharing their thoughts, feelings or responses. How do you motivate them to come forward? And a more broad question on the same topic, which is really asking, is the main problem in online and distance learning losing interest in the process and the involvement in it by the students, and how can we deal with it? So some very specific questions there on motivation. So maybe Liz, you wanted to maybe come in on some of those?
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to quickly respond to that last poll result, because obviously I wasn't one of those many people who said it was worse.
Yeah.
But actually I tried to answer the question, and I decided it wasn't possible to say, because you're not comparing like with like. So, and what does engagement actually mean in that context? So you engage in a face-to-face learning event by attending a tutorial, or you engage in some online learning by undertaking some activities. You can be in a tutorial and you can not be listening or taking anything in at all. So you might be there, but you're not necessarily engaged. So I think there's a big question mark about what engagement means. But just to come back to motivation, I don't think this is just an online issue. And motivation, I've taught in face-to-face universities, and I know that some students are maybe quite unmotivated, and there's a whole host of reasons for that. It could be that it's the wrong course, the wrong choice of course. It could be that particular module they don't like. It could be that they're struggling with something at home. So it's no different in the online environment. So there's lots of different issues which impact on motivation, and we know that really to be a successful student you have to want to do it. So there are ways that you can increase motivation. You make your learning materials attractive. You, as Jan was saying, chunk it into small chunks so that you've got bite size. You've got a little bit of assessment and reward as you go through the process, so that you're keeping people on the bike, if you like, so that and if they fall off, you've got to be there to help pick them up. And that's no different in an online environment than it is to a face-to-face environment. I think feeling part of an academic community, I think there's a few people have touched on this, and this issue of presence, which Dave mentioned. I think you can have presence in an online environment. It's just a different kind of presence. So it's a kind of cultural shift that we need to get people to think differently. If I can answer another question around assessment, and this comes back to Dave's point earlier about what this situation is currently forcing us to reflect on in terms of practice in higher education, is it's really focusing our attention on the things we've known haven't been right for a long time. So academic misconduct isn't just something that happens in an online environment. It happens in face-to-face real environments, and we know that quite often that's because people don't understand what good academic practice is, or it's because we're really lazy in how we set assessment, and we don't think about ways in which we can be innovative in assessment, so that we can, as Dave says, be assessing the process as well as the final product, and thinking about things that actually you can't plagiarize or you can't cheat on because you wouldn't be able to deliver. So I think there's some of those problems that we experience in the face-to-face sector. We are confronting those in that sector now, but they're not something that it's peculiar to an online environment. People are more likely to cheat because they're online. It's just that doesn't hold up for me. So but I think there's a lot that we can learn around all of these issues. But motivation, just to come back to that, I talked about Student Hub Live earlier. I think having an environment where students can feel that they are part of an academic community, that they're not alone, and it doesn't matter if that's in a coffee bar in a cellar in London, or a classroom in Anadolu in Turkey, for example, or online. It's having those relationships and being able to talk, to feel as if you are studying in an academic community and being a student. So that's my little soapbox over.
Thanks, Liz. That's great, thank you. David, would you like to comment on those questions around motivation? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I echo what Liz says, but also I think motivation generically, whether it's online or not, has got to do with whether the individuals involved understand the value of engaging with what's on offer. And I think, perhaps online sometimes struggles a little bit because of that. As I say, sometimes it's not built into people's cultural understanding of what university is. So if you say, I'm going to go and attend a face-to-face lecture, I think part of the motivation is because you're doing university, if you like. And but it's not necessarily a learning motivation, specifically. It's more complex than that. So I think a simple answer to the question, and I wrote a blog post about it, I'll put it in the little announcement thing, I'm not quite sure how far that travels, but anyway, is to be explicit about the value of engaging. So we don't tend to explicitly describe to students what the point of attending a lecture is. We just say you must, because we confuse attendance and engagement. And I think that's what we see all the time, is we assume students are engaged because they're attending, which is definitely not the case necessarily. And so for me, yeah, it's that simple, is that we need to explain to students what the value of them engaging with any mode of education is that we're offering, or with each other in various modes. You know, things like, what's the value of group work? It's an interesting question. If you can't answer that question, then that's where you need to perhaps rethink the approach. If you can't, in very simple terms, say to students, here's the reason that it makes sense for you to engage with this, not just because it's what we do, but because this is the way that it will help you to progress in your education and to become the person you want to become. If you can't answer that question in simple terms, that's when it's time to rethink and redesign.
Thanks, David. That's an interesting perspective. I just wanted to, we haven't got very much time left, and I'll come to you, Senna, in a moment with a follow-up question. But if anyone in the audience would like to share their thoughts in the Q&A, please do. I think, you know, if you could, how about if we ask you to say, if there's one thing you could do to improve online engagement for students, what would that be? Let's see what we get from the audience on that in the final few minutes. So if there's one thing you could do to improve online engagement for students, what would that be? If you just put your answers in the chat, that'd be really interesting, I think, so we can see the range of views on that topic. Now, Senna, I wonder if you could maybe share your thoughts on this question of motivation. And also, we had a question directly to you earlier about what you think about the quality of online courses, and do you think they're of the same quality as face-to-face, which is a very, very big question to answer in a few minutes, but
yeah.
That's you.
Okay. Certainly it is not enough for the current period, but in this term, the Cloud Council is working on a set of standards to introduce outcome-based assessment criteria. If the universities don't comply with these standards in the measurement process, it will be very difficult to monitor the student from a distance. Therefore, it is necessary to give feedback to the student and to determine the quality of learning to be obtained at the end of the evaluation process. Continuous evaluation is required in distance education, and this positively affects the performance and motivation of the student. Especially project-based courses, the system has an important role on development of project from a distance. In the midterm and final exams, given performance project and research-based assignments can be useful and formative for students. But we shouldn't forget the most important thing to create a useful assessment period is providing stable and fast internet connection for all of this process. This is a factor directly affects student performance. And so teaching and learning period cannot be effective and useful. And in addition, such deficiencies brings about the problems in competence issues. I think that students who are educated with these challenges will feel inadequate in terms of the 21st century competence quality during their working life, and deficiency of learning outcomes bring about the lack of knowledge, skills, and competency. And I think my thoughts is like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senna. That's fantastic. And I think also I mentioned at the end, but the next in this series of seminars, we'll be looking at quality assurance in online and distance learning. So that's something for next week. It's just we've had a few questions about from our audience or international audience, probably to the UK delegates here, around the impact of the pandemic on UK higher education, and in particular whether you think that UK universities are going to be more interested in developing online and distance provision and partnerships around the world to deliver programs. That's got a big question, but any of you want to, Jan, yes?
Sorry, I was just indicating the postman just so I was telling him I could see because I knocked on the door. That's fine. I think I just answered that. So some of the work that I've done, in fact, I've got a book coming out. I have to sell myself there on international joint double degrees in August. So for me, it's you know, a true university experience is the broadest experience you can have, and one where you encounter other cultures and learning in other cultures is enormously beneficial. And I would like to hope that the future holds an opening up of those sorts of opportunities for UK universities. I hope. We don't know. We are always constrained by QAA procedures and regulations, but I personally think it's a hugely beneficial, and it's actually something, you know, if we go back to medieval Europe, to travel around Europe as part of your education was part of the university experience. So I think that for me is an international education experience.
Thanks very much. Okay, so we've got just probably 1 or 2 minutes left. We're almost at 3 o'clock. So any David, Liz, Senna, any final closing thoughts? Just very brief. David, would you like to? Yeah,
sure. I mean, I think what we're discovering here is that a lot of, as I mentioned, is that a lot of what we're talking about is higher education in principle. So I just want to reiterate that. And as I said at the start of my section, if you like, we need to separate out the fact that we've all been forced online by a crisis from what the actual pros and cons of online are. So I suppose I just really encourage people to step back and to think about what effective, enjoyable, engaging education looks like across the board, because that's what we're going to gradually go back to, and to avoid wherever possible looking at it from a point of view of face-to-face and online. There's no doubt that a successful approach will involve a combination of the two, and that a really successful approach will involve a combination of the two where the face-to-face flows into the online and the online flows back into the face-to-face, and they're mutually supported. You know, they support each other, they become greater than the sum of their parts. I think what we've come from for most institutions is a situation where everything was face-to-face except for where it had to be online, kind of deficit model. Right now, we're going into a period where it's like the deficit in the other direction. Everything's online except for where it's face-to-face. But by concentrating on by imagining that it's a face-to-face digital divide, rather than just looking at it as different modes of engagement and different modes of presence, I think we risk missing what's potentially really good about it.
Yeah, and quickly, any other closing thoughts? Liz?
Yes, I've just got a couple of thoughts. One is, you know, this is an analogy I've used before in another forum, but and I haven't got the visual aid to help me. But if you imagine a fork, you know, that you eat with, a fork is technology enhanced eating, if you like. So you use that piece of technology to eat. But if you've got soup, this fork is no good whatsoever. So that bit of technology is not going to work in a particular context. And that's something we need to remember when we're thinking about what we use and technology for. So I think I'll just leave it there. I could say more, but I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. And Senna, just your final thoughts, if you have one.
And finally, I want to say that universities are not only a place where we study, but it's also a vital environment that is a different experience from life. But when faced with kinds of unpredictable situation, we couldn't forget that we have the most open adaptation to changing life as a youth of this technological era. Nevertheless, I hope we come back to our schools and our social lives as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we're actually just over 3 o'clock, so I think even though there's a couple more questions, I think we will have to bring it to a close. So I'd just like to thank you all very much, 4 speakers, for some fantastic thoughts there. I think we could have gone on for another hour, discussing some of these issues, but I think it's a really good introduction you all gave, so thank you all very much. I've certainly enjoyed it, and I think our poll question was I think maybe was interesting, and it kind of showed that that it can be oversimplified by saying is one better than the other. So thanks, Liz, for your comments on that. I think that were useful. Just to say that the next session in this series will be next week at the same time, and this one will be looking at how do universities ensure quality teaching online. So it's looking very much at the quality angle of online teaching, and we've got, among others, the Chief Executive of the QAA speaking at that one, so do join us next week. So that's it. So thank you all very much for joining, because I have enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure hopefully we'll continue it in the next one and as the series develops. And thank you all very much to our speakers again.